The night was thick with dread. It was a typical, quiet suburban evening in Enfield, North London, during the summer of 1977. The Hodgson family, Mother Peggy and her 4 children, were about to experience something that would change their lives forever. What began as a strange noise, a knocking that seemed to come from nowhere, quickly spiraled into an all-out war between the living and the dead. It was the kind of thing nightmares were made of. But for the Hodgsons, this was their reality. It started with a knock. At first, they assumed it was the house settling or some old plumbing making noise. But when the sound repeated, louder, more forceful, they began to realize that something wasn't right. Peggy's 11-year-old daughter, Janet, had just sat down on the couch when the first truly disturbing event occurred. A chair, positioned at the kitchen table, suddenly flew across the room with such force it slammed into the wall. No one had touched it. No one had moved. The family was paralyzed with terror. But this was only the beginning. Over the coming days, the hauntings became progressively more violent, with furniture moving on its own, objects flying through the air, and doors slamming shut without explanation. Each moment was more terrifying than the last. And as the family struggled to make sense of what was happening, they would soon realize that this wasn't just any haunting. It was a full-scale attack by an entity far more powerful than they could ever imagine. The truth about the Enfield Poltergeist was darker than anyone could have ever predicted. Janet and her sister Margaret were used to hearing strange noises in the house, but nothing could have prepared them for the terror that awaited them one fateful night. The 2 girls were playing a board game when the first loud crash came from the kitchen. The girls exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to laugh it off or investigate. As they walked cautiously to the kitchen, their hearts skipped a beat when they saw a chair, one that had been at the table moments before, flung across the room. What in God's name? Peggy, their mother, gasped as she walked in. The furniture was undisturbed, the table still set. Yet the chair had been propelled violently across the room, slamming into the opposite wall. The air felt colder than usual, and an unsettling pressure weighed on their chests. Peggy was a woman of reason, but this defied all logic. As the days went on, the phenomena intensified. The knocks on the walls grew louder, more insistent, and they began to hear strange voices whispering from nowhere. At first, they thought it might be the house creaking or the wind blowing through the cracks, but it quickly became clear that these were no ordinary sounds. The whispers weren't just noises, they were words, harsh and guttural, as if the very walls of the house were alive, and they were speaking in a language that only the dead could understand. The first terrifying incident involving Janet occurred one evening after dinner. The family was gathered in the living room when, without warning, the 11-year-old girl screamed in pain. Her body contorted as though an invisible force was pulling her limbs. Her hands twisted at unnatural angles, and her body jerked violently across the room as though it were weightless. "Janet!" Peggy screamed, rushing to her daughter's side. But it was as if the girl didn't even recognize her. Janet's eyes were wide, her face twisted in agony, as if some unseen force had taken hold of her. It wasn't just a child's tantrum, this was something far darker. Something far more sinister. In that moment, the family realized this was no ordinary haunting. They had crossed into a realm where the living and the dead collided, and the spirit they were dealing with was more violent and powerful than anything they could have ever imagined. When Peggy finally called the police, their response was unsurprisingly dismissive. The officers arrived, looked around the house, and saw nothing out of the ordinary. They left, shaking their heads, unable to explain what was happening. But the incidents were escalating. The loud crashes, the violent movements, the unnerving whispers, they were all becoming more frequent, more intense. Desperate, Peggy reached out to the press, hoping for someone who could understand the strange, terrifying events happening within her home. Word quickly spread, and soon the case reached the ears of Ed and Lorraine Warren, 2 of the most famous paranormal investigators in the world. The Warrens had encountered countless hauntings, but nothing had prepared them for what they were about to face in Enfield. Upon their arrival, the Warrens were immediately struck by the overwhelming sense of malevolent energy that hung in the air. The atmosphere was thick, suffocating, and they could feel it the moment they stepped inside. It felt as if the very walls of the house were pulsating with dark energy, as though they were alive with something terrible. The moment the Warrens began their investigation, the house erupted into chaos. Furniture began to move of its own accord, shifting violently across the floor. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the air became charged with an unnatural electricity. Objects flew across the room without explanation, as though an invisible force was hurling them with reckless abandon. A chair flew directly at Ed Warren, narrowly missing his head. As Ed and Lorraine stood there trying to make sense of the chaos, They heard a voice, a deep, guttural growl that echoed from the shadows. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. It was the sound of something ancient and angry, something that had been awakened by the presence of the Warrens. That was when they realized the true scale of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just a poltergeist. It was an ancient evil, an entity of darkness that had taken hold of the house and, more terrifyingly, of Janet. As the days wore on, the hauntings became even more violent. Janet, in particular, was the focus of the entity's attacks. At night, she would often wake up to find herself standing in front of a mirror, staring at her reflection with blank, lifeless eyes. Her mouth would move but no words would come out. She would stare at the reflection as though under some dark, hypnotic spell. One night, the family was gathered in the living room when Janet's body was suddenly jerked upward. Her feet left the ground and she floated, suspended in midair for a moment before being violently slammed back to the floor. Her screams echoed through the house as her body twisted in ways that defied all logic. Her hands curled into unnatural shapes, and her back arched at an impossible angle. The room was filled with a deafening noise, like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. The Warrens could feel the very air around them crackling with malevolent energy. They could see that the entity inside Janet was not just a simple ghost, it was something far more powerful, a force that sought to destroy everything in its path. And it wasn't just Janet that the poltergeist was targeting. The house itself seemed to be alive, its very structure groaning and shifting with every passing moment. Walls would close in on them and doors would slam shut, trapping them inside. It felt as though there was no escape, no place to hide. With each passing day, the family became more desperate. The poltergeist's attacks were relentless. They sought out help from religious leaders, hoping that their prayers would bring peace to the tortured house. But each attempt to cleanse the house only seemed to provoke the entity further. In one of the most terrifying incidents, Janet was found standing in the center of the living room, her eyes wide and blank, staring into the darkness. Her hands twitched violently, and her body trembled with fear. The room was so cold that their breath fogged in the air, and the walls seemed to pulse with dark energy. The poltergeist's voice filled the room. It spoke through Janet, the words coming out of her mouth in a low, menacing tone that made their blood run cold. The voice taunted them, daring them to do something. Anything. But it wasn't just the words that frightened them. It was the overwhelming sense of malice that emanated from every syllable. As Janet struggled to regain control, Peggy did everything she could to hold on to her daughter. But Janet's strength was unnatural. It was as if the very essence of her soul had been consumed by the entity that possessed her. And with each failed attempt to fight back, the poltergeist grew stronger. As the hauntings grew more violent and the family's hope dwindled, Peggy's desperation led her to seek the help of the church. Father McKenna, a local priest, was called in to perform an exorcism on Janet, hoping to drive out the malevolent force that had taken hold of her. But even the priest could feel the suffocating weight of the evil that lingered in the house. It was as if the very air had turned thick with hostility. The first night of the exorcism was nothing short of horrifying. As Father McKenna recited the prayers, Janet began to scream, her voice not her own. The room grew colder still, and an eerie silence fell over the house, broken only by the low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very walls. Janet's body contorted, twisting and jerking violently, as though the unseen force was trying to tear her apart from the inside. Father McKenna pressed on, his voice unwavering as he called upon the power of God to banish the demon. But the poltergeist was not going to give up easily. The furniture in the room began to move again, scraping across the floor, as though some invisible force was dragging it. A mirror shattered, its pieces flying across the room like sharp daggers. And through it all, Janet's screams echoed, each one more desperate than the last. In a final act of defiance, the poltergeist threw Janet across the room with a force that left her unconscious. The room was plunged into an eerie silence as the exorcism came to a halt. Father McKenna, exhausted and shaken, fell to his knees. He knew the battle was far from over. The demon had not been defeated, it had simply retreated for now, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The family was on the brink of collapse. The poltergeist had not only tormented them physically but mentally as well. The isolation, the constant fear, the endless nights of terror had broken them down. Yet they pressed on, determined to protect Janet, who seemed to be the only one truly affected by the haunting. In the days that followed the failed exorcism, strange things continued to happen. Objects would levitate only to fall and shatter on the floor. Doors slammed open and shut with no explanation. Yet, despite the poltergeist's increased attacks, there were moments where Janet appeared to be free from its grasp, as if a part of her had regained control. But the entity was patient. It was waiting. The final showdown would come when the family least expected it. It happened late one night. Peggy and the children had fallen asleep, exhausted from weeks of terror. The house was eerily still, as though the poltergeist itself was lying in wait. Suddenly, Janet let out a bone-chilling scream that shattered the silence. Peggy rushed into her room, only to find her daughter standing at the foot of her bed, her body completely rigid. Her eyes were wide, staring into the darkness, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. Without warning, Janet's body was thrown backward, slamming into the wall with such force that the entire house seemed to shake. Her limbs twitched violently as though she were trapped in a nightmare. The room was freezing, and the air was thick with the presence of the poltergeist, as though it was wrapping itself around them like a suffocating fog. But Peggy refused to give in. She grabbed her daughter, pulling her to safety, even as the poltergeist continued to throw objects around the room. She screamed for help, desperate for someone to end this nightmare once and for all. And that's when the house seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, and the furniture moved as if directed by some unseen hand. The very foundation of the house began to shake, and a low, rumbling sound echoed from deep within the earth. The air was charged with raw, unfathomable power. The poltergeist was no longer just a haunting. It had become a full-scale assault on their very existence. In the midst of the chaos, Father McKenna returned. He had been called by the family in desperation, knowing that this was their last chance. With the help of a team of investigators, the priest prepared for one final exorcism. The room was filled with the voices of the dead, as though the very spirits of the house had risen to join in the battle. As Father McKenna began the final incantations, Janet's body jerked and spasmed uncontrollably. Her mouth opened wide, and the same low guttural voice that had tormented the family echoed out once again. "You cannot win," the voice hissed, its words laced with malice. "I will never leave. This house is mine." But Father McKenna pressed on, chanting louder, his voice filled with an unwavering determination. The poltergeist screeched in rage, the walls cracking as if they were about to collapse under the weight of the evil that had taken root. The air was thick with tension and the temperature dropped to freezing. For a moment, it seemed as though the world itself would tear apart. And then, in a final burst of energy, the poltergeist screamed. A sound so deafening that it felt as if the very fabric of reality was being torn in two. With one last, violent thrust, the entity was expelled from Janet's body, and everything went silent. The house was still. In the weeks that followed, the family struggled to return to some semblance of normalcy. Janet, now free from the torment of the poltergeist, slowly began to recover. But the memories of the terrifying events would haunt her for the rest of her life. The family left the house soon after, unable to bear the weight of the horrors they had endured. As for the house in Enfield, it was never quite the same. The poltergeist, it seemed, had left a permanent mark on the property. But while the terror had subsided, there was still a lingering sense of unease in the air. The walls no longer whispered, the furniture no longer moved on its own, but the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to hold secrets. Secrets that the family would never fully understand. The Enfield Poltergeist became one of the most famous hauntings in history, a case that would go on to haunt the imaginations of millions. It was a story of supernatural terror, of a family pushed to the brink of madness, and of an entity that defied all attempts to banish it. But in the end, the poltergeist had been defeated, not by strength but by the strength of